I'd like to get started with some media coverage that first motivated us to explore this subject. And I would like to throw this over to you, Andreas, because in one of our previous discussions about the topic of digital marketing measurement, you mentioned these 3 articles. One is about eBay, another one is about Adidas, and the third one is about Topshop. Can you summarize what these articles are about and what they have in common and what the lessons learned are?
Yes, of course. So maybe let's travel back in time a little bit. In the very early days, what all the different marketers did, they took the numbers as they came in from publisher side, and then they just tried to tweak these numbers. So all the effort went into increasing performance based on what someone played back to you. And we had data scientists and the smartest people we have on our planet sitting in front of their computers and optimizing campaigns. And they all thought, wow, this is very sophisticated and high end, and it drives a lot of success. Until the point when somebody said, hold on a second, there is correlation and there's causality. And people, of course, they will always click on ads. And if they click on ads, they might also buy. So in the early days, we just thought, okay, this, of course, the clicks lead to the sales in the end. And at some point, people started questioning this. And eBay was probably the most prominent case where they started to stop advertising on their branded terms. And everybody was scared because you saw phenomenal numbers, people searching for whatever, eBay standalone or eBay with different combinations, and they cut that all off. And as an artifact, there were amazing numbers coming in. So the whole organization was scared to lose revenue. So they stopped these campaigns and they realized, wow, it's just nothing happening. We are getting exactly the same we got before. And the Topshop case is pretty similar. They saw all the revenues through performance advertising, especially retargeting, lower funnel coming in. And at some point, they stopped that and they realized, okay, there is just nothing happening. And similar Adidas. So they at some point realized the game is not being as efficient as possible and driving the numbers as you see them. It's rather there's a shift happening where you need to be very accurate in what you measure, and then you steer your campaigns against the real numbers coming in. And that's a fundamental change in the end. And there are lots of companies who discover that spend should actually happen way more upper funnel, because this is what's driving performance, while the lower funnel stuff is mostly an artifact in the numbers, because there are people who are inclined to buy. So the trick of the ad industry was always, let's figure out who's gonna buy next, and then let's squeeze our ad in there, and then we claim the sale. And you can actually play that game so that your numbers are really inflated, but then you just see phenomenal performance, but it's not real. And this is something which wasn't very common a couple of years ago, but today there's way more awareness, in my opinion. At least the smart guys have started to question the numbers as they come in. And we need to understand the rules of the game, in my opinion, because we have a publisher and they run a business, of course. So they want to get as much budget as possible. And advertisers are making investment decisions usually based upon what they see in terms of numbers coming in. So the better the numbers you can show and make others believe in, the more budget you will get. And both parties need to understand that game. And the only way to get it right is to be very, very critical when you see numbers, and you have to get a sense for what's really coming in. And this is kind of what makes the case for better measurement. And we move away from tactical aspects, just optimizing numbers as they come in, as we see them.
Madan, what Andreas is describing is some sort of advertising bubble. to what extent is advertising less effective than advertisers thought it would be?
Yeah, Andreas did a great job summarizing the argument, and I plus everything he said. I actually agree with most of what he said. You know, as a point of validation to what he's saying, on our side, we've had an incrementality measurement business for the last 4 years. A lot of me and my team have been in measurement for the last 10, 15 years. So we've seen a lot of this go up and down. So from our experience, I'll tell you that if you just sum up all the publisher last click attribution totals, what Facebook is claiming as what they drove from a last click perspective, and Google and you know, OTT and affiliates and whatnot, a lot of times you'll see that the total number of conversions sum up to something like 150, 200, 250% of the total business, right? So it's clear that multiple publishers are claiming credit for the same conversions, and clearly publishers, what they claim as performance is what they really drive for their business, right? No question about that. This is what we call the duplication problem in measurement, but it's kind of prevalent across the board, no question about that. But I also want to make a slightly contrarian point here, which is that media actually works. It clearly does not work nearly as well as publishers claim it does, but it kind of works, you know, to some extent. It works somewhere between 1/10 of what publishers claim to about half of what they claim. It never works 100% of what they claim, right? It's somewhere between 10% to 50% is kind of what a rough number you can think of, right? Now, we've seen the total contribution of media for a brand. If you sum up the total contribution of all your media investments and what it drove for your top line, for a business like an Amex or an AT&T or a Verizon, giant businesses, it'll be small. It'll be like 3%, 4%, 5%. That's what media can drive for a $100 billion business. But if you look at a smaller brand, emerging DTC brands that are 30, 40, $50 million businesses, you know, media could drive north of 80% in contribution. So when we do all this, you know, dedupe all the conversions, apply incrementality, media still drives the big chunk of growth for the brand. But clearly, what to Andreas' point, you cannot take the publisher numbers as is. You have to apply incrementality on top of it, and then you can consume it for optimization. Then the picture looks entirely different, and you can absolutely get more bang for your buck and make your dollars work really, really stronger. But today, as things stand today, a lot of budgets are still allocated based on last click metrics. Therefore, investment is super concentrated on the lower part of the funnel, and a lot of it is wasteful.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, you are representing here the advertiser side. Do you feel the industry is experiencing this sort of paradigm shift where advertisers tend to no longer rely on what the platforms provide in terms of data?
I have to say, I wish everyone would be as passionate as Andreas was in his speech about retargeting and media problems in general. I don't necessarily see a paradigm shift. I have, at least not on a larger scale. Yeah, you see some advertisers that move into the direction. Generally speaking, more advanced advertisers with more experience. Yeah, but you see a lot of smart marketers building their own models. They're ahead of the curve, and we will see at one point probably a shift in that direction. I don't see that, and especially small and medium businesses, as Madan just pointed out, are still relying way too heavily on the publisher data. Yeah, and especially I see even challenges for companies that are ahead of the curve, because most of them build their models based on what they have learned over the last 10 years with Facebook and Google. So there's always a false positive.
Madan?
To add quickly to what Daniel just mentioned, there's a lot of time and effort going, for example, into, let's say, Amazon bidding solutions. There are dozens of providers out there, and what they do, and all of them, they take the numbers as they come in from Amazon, and then they claim, okay, we can improve these numbers by whatever, 20%. We are 20% better than the other algorithm. The problem is if you don't know whether you get 100% of what you see or maybe just a 2%, then everything is fundamentally wrong. So improving something which is not accurate in the first place by 20% is probably not the right, you don't invest your time and effort at the right point and it won't move the needle. So compare advertiser A working with the best AI-driven bidding solution and advertiser B doing everything just manually, but has a solid understanding of what he truly gets. B will be way better than A. So it's not about being more efficient. I think in the future it needs to change. You have to better understand what you're truly getting instead of trying to run faster and faster, but still into the wrong direction.
Madan, assuming everybody would get the measurement game right, how would the digital advertising world look? So I assume there would be winners and losers on the publisher's side. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I'm going to ask for a slide to be brought up. So I totally understand the question, but I would the fault lines in the media world don't really fall along publishers, but they fall along the funnel. Is kind of where it falls right now. So even when you go to the next slide, 16 probably, even when you look at Google and Facebook, where you buy media from all the time, what actually happens is that you're not just buying Facebook, you're buying retargeting on Facebook. You're targeting your existing customers on Facebook. You're buying prospecting, which is lookalike audiences and broad audiences and interest targeting audiences on Facebook. That's kind of what you're actually buying. And the incrementality on each one of these audiences are very different, okay? The prospecting audiences are far more incremental, and the retargeting and the CRM audiences are far less incremental. In general, if you think of the funnel, the lower part of the funnel, the media that targets the lower part of the funnel, there are consumers with higher intent and therefore a higher baseline and therefore a lower incrementality. And if you go up in the funnel, they have lower intent and therefore lower sort of last touch conversion rates, but higher incrementality, right? So this is kind of a fundamental sort of truth about measurement today. So to your point, what would happen if everybody measured perfectly? If everybody measured perfectly, I would expect the investment goes up funnel. It goes from retargeting, from brand search, from CRM targeting into more, Facebook prospecting, more shopping, more OTT. Also, what we are finding is that as people learn more about measurement, is that the media doesn't work the same way for different customer segments. The media that works for new customer acquisition may be very different than what you serve for existing customers. Very often we find with retailers, especially retailers who've had a big catalog anchor, we spent a lot on catalog for the last 10, 20 years, we find that digital and social are better vehicles for new customer acquisition, but catalog continues to be a workhorse for existing customers, for example. So horses for courses, so to speak. So the fault lines are definitely along the funnel. And if you measure it perfectly, the winners may still be Google and Facebook, but you might end up finding that you invest your dollars far more upper funnel in demand gen as opposed to lower funnel in retargeting and demand harvesting, I would say.
Andreas, I think Madan brought up a very interesting point about understanding incrementality being key to measure successfully. Would you subscribe to this observation that this is key to fix fundamental problems in the industry? I guess you're muted.
Sorry for that. I do. I think the fundamental problem we have here is that we tend to target people who are inclined to buy already. And these people convert at a very high rate. And if we just take these numbers for granted, everything which is at the bottom of the funnel will look amazing. And it seems to justify higher investments. However, what we do not see is that a lot of these sales we would have gotten anyway without even showing ads. You can compare it. Imagine someone has, you give vouchers away. So salespeople stand on the streets and want to promote, let's say, a Zara store on Broadway. And you can have someone being far away handing out these vouchers, and then you observe the performance. And you will see very few people will actually go to Zara and buy. So apparently this doesn't perform well. So the next guy comes and goes right to the register in Zara and hands over people waiting in the line. In this case, of course, they will all redeem their vouchers, but did this actually drive the sales? And it's very clear it wouldn't. And I think we need to figure out whether we should actually go after these people who are inclined, or what we are allowed to bid actually, what is the true value which comes in. And if we rely on the systems coming from the networks, it always incentivizes us, if we take a look at the numbers, to go lower funnel. And this is the change which needs to happen.
What you're bringing up is the problem of what value do you attribute to certain touch points within the customer journey. And I think the topic of attribution is one that needs to be also discussed if we talk about incrementality. Daniel, as you're coming from the advertiser side, do you feel that attribution has lived up to marketers' expectations?
Well, definitely not to my expectations, and I have pretty high expectations to be honest. There's always a balance and between accuracy and granularity. For attribution, depending on the model you choose, but you can be very granular. And Madan was alluding to it, to the different models you have. You can be granular, but you are not accurate. And if you look at incrementality, you cannot be as granular, which for me as a marketer is totally fine. But for me and my teams always has been accuracy #1 priority. And I think that's where the problem lies, that people lose themselves, if you will, in like going into the deepest grain, but not understanding the issue that Andreas was alluding to, is that we're looking at the wrong picture, and we're looking not at where is the sale actually coming from. If you have someone miles away from the store handing out vouchers, that's having the incremental effect of additional sales, not the one that handing over coupons at the register.
I think it's a very, very interesting topic and a very interesting point to bring up. Andreas, what's your take on the pros and cons of weighing the granularity with the accuracy of incrementality testing? How would you compare also those two concepts?
So first of all, I would agree that in the first place, it's most important that you have some level of accuracy, that you can rely on your numbers. And if you don't have, let's say, credits available on a per click level, you can still do a decent job. At the same time, we're seeing that AI has advanced quite a bit. And if you take a look at Google ROAS, for example, it's doing a brilliant job taking credits into account. You push back on a per click level so that Google can actually make better decisions. So I do feel there is a need going forward where we bring these two concepts together. Ideally, we would have something which is accurate in terms of incrementality, but we still have a mechanism where we can push back values to each click which happened prior to a click, while not distorting the whole picture. And we see, for example, that Google is reacting in a very, very good way to data activation in that sense, and they automatically move budgets along the customer journey. We can, for example, on the Google side, there are lots of limitations as well. For example, in Google Shopping, there's no way to exclude audiences. So we cannot say, let's just aim for very high ROAS if we target cart abandoners, because Google will just override it and see there's there are bids coming in from a different segment, so we can make some more money. So let's rather allocate that click to a different bucket and apply a different ROAS target. So it's hard to actually manage these low funnel segments towards the ROAS we would like to have. And one way to circumvent this is by pushing back the manipulated values on a per click level, so that Google actually is forced or automatically makes these decisions. And I think there's a way to go still, but that's probably where we will end up in a couple of years.
I guess what also needs to be considered here is that how attribution traditionally got approached by tracking the value of touch points on a per click level is also going to get increasingly more different. There is big debates about the privacy related issues, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think we all observe how the regulations are changing. Madan, do you feel that attribution under these circumstances will still be feasible going forward?
Yeah, so a good point that you're making here, but I would say that attribution, there are two flavors of attribution: third-party attribution and first-party attribution. Okay, third-party attribution driven by third-party cookies like DoubleClick and third-party vendors in general, that's either dead or almost dead, right? It's pretty much on the way out. First-party attribution, on the other hand, is actually pretty strong. Now, as an example, if you take the Facebook last touch results that they present to you, is a first-party attributed result. What's happening is that they know exactly what content they're serving to you because it's a logged-in environment. You're inside the Facebook app or inside the browser. You're logged in. You're consuming content as a Facebook ID, not as an anonymous cookie. And when you convert, the attribution happens back to your Facebook ID, right? They have the strongest device graph on the planet. There's no question that it's going to have the best resolution in providing first-party attribution. No question about that. You can make the same argument about matchback reporting on catalog or first-party, any other first-party attribution, like even Google for that matter. So that's going to live on. At least my opinion is that's going to live on. But there's a point to be understood that if you go back to 2000, 2001, 2002, attribution was equal to measurement, right? It was basically a direct substitute for measurement. Today, attribution is only tracking. It's not measurement anymore. You have to marry incrementality testing to attribution. You combine them both, you end up with marketing measurement. Otherwise, you end up with just tracking. So all you're doing is tracking publishers who are in the path of a conversion, who might have influenced the conversion, but clearly did not drive the conversion. There's a lot of factors that came together to drive it. And for you to understand that, today the most reliable way to do that is incrementality testing. So our recommendation to marketers would be to use first-party attribution, use Facebook attribution, Google attribution, use their results as is, okay? But marry it with incrementality testing, and you combine them both together, you end up with incremental metrics, incremental CPA, incremental ROAS, and the rest of the process can follow as is. Once you have, let's say, for example, all search marketers out there, it's trivial for you to understand how much to bid on a keyword based on your conversion rate. You give a conversion rate, you have a target CPA, it translates to a very clean bid, right? Now, if you have a conversion rate, there's an assumption that the conversion rate is 100% incremental today. Now, if it's only 50% incremental, you just take the 50% incremental conversion rate, multiply your target ROAS or target CPA, you get the same bid again, right? It's kind of trivial from that perspective to approach incrementality-based bidding, right? The challenge, though, is to understand now what should your target CPA be? Because you used to have a different target, now it's a different target. How do you set it, whatnot? And we have some thoughts about that we can share. But that's the challenge for marketers today. But the real key takeaway that I'd say is definitely test and take the results from the testing, use that as your causal metric. Don't take the publisher metrics coming out of the box. Those are just tracking metrics to tell you how many conversions they saw in their funnel. I
mean, it brings I guess three concepts now to the table. There is the attribution concept, there is incrementality, and there is also first-party data activation. There is a very interesting paper out there which outlines a way how to also combine these three elements. Andreas, I know you're familiar with the paper. Would you briefly outline it and also explain a bit if you feel this is already in the marketer's toolbox at this point of time?
So first of all, I don't feel that this is something anybody is doing at this point of time. I do find that the concept itself makes a lot of sense because ultimately we're talking about very similar things. What we want to have is we want to be able to measure as accurately as possible. Ideally, we would like to activate the data. So we would like to put it back to the click level. Why do we want it there? Because biddable media needs to understand what the value per click is and then bid accordingly. If we just test for incrementality, there will be segments which within the segments have different incrementality coefficients. So if you have, let's say, non-brand Google Shopping, that's a pretty large bucket, and there are people who are highly incremental, clicks which are highly incremental, and clicks which have a lower incrementality. And now we can act or operate with some average, but there's definitely more potential in there. And the problem in my opinion, is that we struggle testing very tiny little segments. We can't have in non-brand Google Shopping like 50 segments which we constantly test for incrementality. It's just not feasible. So there should ideally be ways to match the incrementality we measure on the segments we can measure, but still activate the data. And the paper is making a case for it. For example, there are things like people who have seen one ad already, they don't receive the same credits on the subsequent clicks on ads because they already consumed one and they assume that incrementality will go further down. I think the whole privacy discussion makes things a bit more complicated. We don't see all the data anymore, and it's not gonna get easier, but still we do see when we do first-party attribution still a considerable amount of data. So there should be ways to actually inform biddable media systems in a still better way. Otherwise, our game would be very boring. There's definitely still some room for further improvement. So I do like the concept, but we are definitely not there yet.
Now we've tackled some conceptual problems. I think we'll come back to some practical problems as well. However, I also think we need to discuss another aspect, and that is the organizational struggle. I think it's easy to get consensus that challenging what's being done on a measurement side within an organization is important, but it is not so easy to actually get this going inside a running organization. Daniel, what are the challenges that you have observed? You have an insider view on
I think lost you, Irene, but I hope everyone else hears me. Yeah, no, I don't. Okay. We have a slide for that. I believe it's slide 12 that talks about that. So you have two challenges to say. So you have always technology and practice. Yeah, Madan and team, they cover all the technology and they're doing an awesome job with that. But there's also the practicality of it. Yeah, so who is managing that project internally? And even more important, how you sell that internally. Andreas was alluding to it multiple times already. Say when you say, oh, numbers looked so great in the past. Yeah, if you do an incrementality test, you will very likely find that all your retargeting campaigns are not incremental. Yeah, you paid for customers that are already there. That means you will reduce your spend there. Yeah, and for the marketing departments, yeah. The CPAs, cost per sale, ROIs go down, CPAs go up, and everything look on paper not very fortunate for the marketing department. So it's a huge organizational challenge. Fun fact on the other side is overall, you will see not an impact. Yeah, if you reduce your retargeting spend, yeah, or your ineffective spend, you will see, yeah, Google CPAs going up, Facebook CPAs going up. Interesting enough, overall ROI is going up as well, and CPAs are going down because you stop paying for those customers that are coming anyway. So there's a lot of internal convincing, if you will, to do. Yeah, and I went through that multiple times, and now here at Your Super, for example, we agreed from day one on that we only look at our overall numbers and not even bothering looking at Facebook and Google data, other than obviously for the right bidding.
Very, very interesting and very valid point of view. Madan, you are the one who has a lot of experience in putting this into practice. How do you usually approach this?
Yeah, so what we tell marketers, right? Of course, I'm wearing a vendor jersey, and I don't wear, Daniel's experience is much more, visceral. We're, of course, vendors to a brand, so take it with a pinch of salt. But the incoming advice for us that we always offer is measurement's really never about measurement. Measurement's really about decisions, right? I mean, there's a saying that we use inside the company quite a bit, that there is no perfect test. There's only useful tests and useless tests, right? So you're really trying to use testing and measurement as a way to make better decisions. That's really the goal. So when you go into an organization, the key is to understand what decision matrix that you have, and that measurement's really going to have an effect. So if you want to have a measurement project, like an incrementality project or a testing project, take off in the company, first thing to do is have a pretty good sense for your objective. Like, what is your strategy? Like, for example, you'll walk in, there'll be a brand that has been very traditional, has anchored on catalog, that's trying to move to digital, right? So their goal is to sort of move their spend to digital and sort of make it work on the digital brand. Now, you can't do it without proper measurement in place, because you would be spending on all these places that don't make any sense, right? So that's a really good example of anchoring on an actual marketing strategy. Number one. Number two, you nominate somebody like Daniel to actually lead the project, somebody senior who has enough gravitas in the organization that they can actually make a case for measurement, and it will actually be heard, and you will actually win executive sponsorship, right? So that's number two. Number three, give the person time to make it work. This usually takes about between 2 and 4 quarters for something like this to stick in the organization. So this is not something you can pull off in a month or two. So give it a few quarters for it to stick, and really focus on actually seeing how the quality of the decisions move before and after you put experimentation and measurement into the company. So, broadly speaking, those are the broad sort of at least incoming direction we offer up. And of course, it really depends on where the brand wants to take the project. But fundamentally, you need good sponsorship. That's number one. But you also need a really good understanding of what decisions you're making and how measurement's going to impact those decisions.
And I think I would like to add what Madan said. I think you should not underestimate time. Like, we are all digital marketers and believe everything can be measured tomorrow. Yeah, we can make changes in a week from now. This takes time. Yeah, if you want to make right decisions, yeah, take the time to set up the test, analyze the data, and make the right decisions. I think that's really, really important. And we are in a fast-pacing world, and believe that small changes can change our world completely. No, actually, it's not. It's not. And you make the best decisions if you take time, look at the data, analyze, and make informed decisions.
Yeah, and I'd probably add one aspect to this. If you apply the right methodology, and I think that's a good point for us to shift gears a little bit and get into the weeds of how this can actually be approached from a practical perspective. Madan, can you briefly outline how you do incrementality testing in order to get the most reliable results?
Yeah, go back to slide 15 if you don't mind. it's a broad question. I'll give you a summarized answer. If any one of these points are interesting, we can dig into it. So fundamentally, guys, the way it works is that experimentation breaks down into two. If you go to the next slide, maybe experimentation breaks down into sort of two buckets: what we call audience testing, audience splitting, or audience-based testing, or market splitting and market-based testing, right? So in terms of audience splitting, what you're trying to do is you're trying to take an audience. Let's say, for example, you have a Facebook interest targeting audience, or a Facebook lookalike audience, or you know, on the OTT side, imagine you have a bunch of segments you're targeting, or whatever it is, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to split the same audience into two cells, an A and a B, making sure they're randomly selected. There's no bias in who you select, and then serve the cell A and campaign treatment, and cell B a control treatment. And a control treatment could be as simple as just holding them out and observing their performance, or serving them a PSA, right? Depending on the platform, you have to do one or the other, right? A catalog is another great example. If you can take a bunch of people you're about to mail, hold them out of the mailing, and then measure how they perform in the matchback reporting, okay? That's called audience splitting. And a lot of channels, you can take on an audience splitting approach for experimentation. It is the preferred approach. It has the most strength and entropy with respect to the power of the experiment is much higher. You can read much smaller variations in depth. But not all channels it's possible to do that. Many channels, TV is a good example, you can't do that. And even in many of the Google channels, you can't do that. So we take a geo-match market-based market splitting approach. In this approach, what we do is we kind of cluster the entire country into markets. Maybe, you know, there's a New York cluster, maybe there's a Texas cluster, a California cluster, Florida cluster, depending on how they perform, depending on how those markets kind of move together, conversion rates, audiences, and whatnot, right? And within those clusters, we'll identify smaller markets like Rhode Island, Connecticut, Kentucky, and actually test whatever new treatments you want to test. Maybe you want to turn off search. Maybe you want to, like, you know, double up on shopping, or maybe you want to, like, you know, try Snap at a 3x, 4x level of spend, whatnot. All of those things you can do within those markets and figure out how those markets react and use that as a way for testing, right? So there's, on a broad basis, two approaches, audience splitting and market splitting. And then we have two types of testing underneath that. One is what we call incrementality testing, where you're trying to understand what is the return for what you're investing right now. And the second type of test is called scale testing, where you actually go in and, you know, increase the spend by 1, 2, 3, 4x and see how much scale and how much diminishing return you see with increased investments on those channels. So that's the very high level of how testing gets executed in practice.
Andreas, I know you and run also many incrementality tests with clients, especially in paid search. How is your approach there?
That's basically exactly what Madan just outlined. There are several limitations on the search side. There is no possibility to randomize audiences properly, to show ghost ads or something like that. So we are forced into a geo approach, and the way it works is that you select different regions. We usually take an approach where we roughly take 20% of the budget. So we select different regions which correlate in their metrics in terms of clicks and CPCs and conversions. They perform in a similar way. And then we have a few regions for the holdout group and a few regions for the test group. And then we are also limited in the sense, at least when it comes to Google Shopping, what we'd love to do is test, for example, just the retargeting part. But Google does not allow to exclude audiences. So we need to find workarounds and things you can do. You can get a proxy if you test just the text ads, which we would assume behave in a somewhat similar way. And with text ads, you're allowed to exclude audiences. So you can try to find smart ways to get as close as possible, while it's never going to be perfect, because technically it's simply not feasible in the way we would like it to do. In Google's defense, to explain why this isn't possible, this is not anything where Google tries that we don't have full transparency It's rather that they think about the users as well. Think about you trying to shop for something and you see a product today, you click on it, then an hour later you go back onto the Google Shopping platform and the product is not there anymore. So they just want to make sure that you have no way to exclude it, because there are two different perspectives. There's a user who wants to find the product. So if the retargeting hits, he immediately gets what he was looking for. The advertiser doesn't want to pay for it because it's not incremental. So what the advertiser would do is I take the product away. The guy will make the effort and find its way to the product, navigates to my website and will buy it. And Google is just trying to limit this a little bit. So in my opinion, on the search side, especially on Google Shopping, it's in most cases by far the largest and most impactful bucket. And that's exactly the one where incrementality testing is difficult, and also the data activation piece isn't that trivial, but it's key to success.
Daniel, you've also implemented incrementality tests as well. What tips can you provide?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you need a full commitment from the entire organization, or from at least everyone involved in not only in the testing, but also in like changes that might come after that. I think that that's really, really important, because you probably find things you don't like or you didn't expect, but you have to execute on them. Yeah. There's a clear distinction. We were alluding to it multiple times here now in that webinar. It's like between prospecting and retargeting. Yeah, you have to that set up. I personally also want to distinguish between, are we doing it internally or with an external third party? I'm leaning more at external third parties, because if I saw it so many times, if you build something internally, you build it with a bias. Yeah, you build something you want to wish the outcome is. Yeah, you don't want to have an outcome that all of a sudden your CPAs double. Yeah, so I want to reduce. I personally want to reduce the internal bias. Yeah, work with an external vendor, and last but not least, have a clear decision metrics, yeah, and a learning agenda for experimentation. I think especially when it comes to decision metrics, as I alluded to at the beginning, is that there were things you will learn you probably did not expect, especially if you have relied heavily on Facebook and Google data. You will learn, oh my God, things didn't work out as we expected. So what are the next steps? Where are we investing? Do we have the right setup in our organization? And so on and so forth.
Fantastic. I will now start picking up some questions that we've already received from our audience. And the first question is actually a pretty tough one in my opinion, but I love it. Somebody asked, how does one parse out causality and attribution modeling with incrementality changes? Because machine learning models mostly react to strong signals and correlations on lower funnels. When experimenting with upper funnel, where does one get those strong signals?
Yeah, so I'll take a first swing at this. Andreas, Daniel, feel free to jump in. So there is a class of experiments that we call always on experiments. Like our Facebook approach is an always on approach for experimentation, where we're always testing in the background, okay? So for example, if the use case is the machine learning picked up a new signal, a new creative, or a new sort of new audience cluster that is pretty strong intent, it identifies those clusters, serves them creatives, and the last touch metrics are through the roof. And you could have two perspectives on this. One, either they had a low intent the low baseline to begin with. None of those people are bought anyway, so the baseline's low. The incrementality continues to be high. Okay, another use case would be they just found a bunch of audiences that behave like retargeting. The intent's actually high because they're being targeted elsewhere, right? Now, if you have an always on experiment, what it will do is the baseline for those audiences also will go up. The incrementality will shrink. And so it'll automatically sort of report out what the incremental ROAS, CPA, conversion rate metrics are. And you can just focus on optimizing to the incremental metrics, and the rest of the stuff will just fall into place. So that's an example of an always on experiment where something like this would automatically get sort of accounted for. Let me pause right there.
Madan, I have a question from my side out of curiosity, because we couldn't solve that yet. What do you do with seasonality impacts? Because, for example, we had one client and they realized, okay, on whatever Black Friday, we get lots of people who just tend to buy once and then never come back. So does mentality change over time? Because this makes everything way more complex.
Yeah, it absolutely changes over time. There's actually a slide I'm going to show you. It's not exactly the point I wanted to make, but go to slide number 2, Mark. Incrementality, actually has an inverse relationship to conversion rate, typically. I mean, because as you go lower funnel, the conversion rate, the last touch conversion rate goes up. And because there is inbuilt intent, the incrementality actually goes down. So here's an example where this is actually CRM house file segments, but this is by recency. The conversion rate, you can see the gray line over there. The response rate goes down with recency. But look at incrementality, the orange line. It goes up as the conversion rate goes down. This is very common, by the way. We see it across the board. We see it there's an example of prospecting retargeting. Within retargeting, we'll see that different segments within retargeting will look like this. CRM looks like this. So, and it won't be perfect, but this is kind of the patterns that we observe all the time. The question always comes down to, how do I now, do I optimize for incrementality? Do I optimize for conversion rate? Well, we optimize for the incremental conversion rate, or the incremental CPA, the incremental ROAS. And you can see the next graph on the bottom, the green line represents the incremental ROAS. So that now combines the blast touch conversion rates with the incrementality measured. Now you end up with essentially the same metrics in incremental terms, which you can then use to optimize. Sorry, I lost track of the question. What was the question, Andreas?
I guess.
How do you tackle this, that incrementality coefficients actually change over time? And
with seasonality.
Change in short time frames even.
Yeah, that's a good question. So seasonality, what happens is in this always-on experimentation framework we talked about, what will happen, we typically see during holiday time, the overall conversion rates all pick up because everybody's buying, but actually baseline also picks up with it. So incrementality actually goes down most of the time, but if you combine incrementality and the conversion rate, it's still worth investing, but it doesn't look nearly as good in incremental terms as it looks in last touch terms, right? Number one. Number two, different media tactics respond differently during seasonality. Like for example, retargeting, tanks during high promotion times, during seasonality, during like holiday seasons and whatnot. It almost goes to 50%, 70% of what it was originally incrementality. So it may go from 12-15% incrementality to like literally like 5-6% incrementality on retargeting. And prospecting also comes down, but does not come down as much. So typically what happens during holiday periods and promotional periods is that your investment thesis will flip. It'll become a lot more prospecting, almost no retargeting, because the promotions and the seasonality is doing the work for you. You don't have to go and like chase people around the internet to sell them stuff. You just have to bring them to the site and let the product do the job.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Just because you just were covering that, especially like retargeting campaigns. And I remember when you and I are talking time in March and April, you saw a significant dip in retargeting performance. Maybe that's also interesting for the audience to hear. I think that's quite interesting to share.
Yeah, during COVID times, we found very interesting insights. Of course, retail really got hammered. Everybody knows that. There's no secret. But e-com actually did really well. I mean, across the board, minus clients who had retail exposure, they struggled to invest in e-com. But people who did, it just took off. Facebook conversion rates were through the roof. The cost per CPMs came down. So the ROAS numbers, the incremental ROAS, incremental CPA were all like incredibly positive. So investment actually went up on all the social channels during that time. And also, as Daniel was talking about, the retargeting and prospecting had opposite effects. Retargeting actually went down during those times. Prospecting actually went up during those times. And it was interesting to see that shift, and a lot of marketers jumped on the bandwagon, actually go. The people who did really well were the ones who aggressively marketed into e-com during the COVID crisis. If they did that, the businesses basically just like took off 200, 300%. And many of them actually made up for the loss in retail with e-com alone. It was phenomenal to see. Some of our brands actually had like holiday type sales, like Black Friday type sales peaks during COVID times. So, clearly it is a distressful time, but, it actually had very different impact on e-commerce as retail.
We already touched very briefly upon the topic of media mix, and I have a very interesting question in that regards. So the question is, which approach would you use with regard to evaluating optimizing a brand's media mix model? For example, considering top and bottom of the funnel media, which incremental media investment or combination would drive the biggest yield or return on ad spend? I'd like to throw that over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, I definitely will also hand it over to Andreas, because I know he has lots of feedback for that. But on my end, it's like in my teams, I probably heard that during that webinar already. I'm not a big fan of retargeting. So I will invest most of the budget, probably 95% of all of my marketing budget in prospecting campaigns. Still, the question remains, is it Facebook? Is it Google? Is it OTT, TV? That obviously depends completely on the business model, on the target group, but generally a healthy mix. I think that's here the important point. 10, 15 years ago, everyone started with Google. Andreas knows that. Everyone started with Google and built their Google campaigns and completely rely on search. Now, all new businesses start basically on social, because it's so easy to build like a campaign, generate traffic, generate sales, and so on and so forth. Problem with that is then you have a heavily reliance on social media. And if that channel goes down, your whole business is going down. So I always prefer a very stable mix between all channels. I would always throw in Google, Facebook campaigns, OTT, YouTube. If done right, these can be very, very, very supportive campaigns for your business. I'm personally not a big fan of all businesses that claim view-through conversions. I haven't seen incrementality with that. But other than that, an as balanced as possible media mix, I would say, and you have to work with Facebook, you have to work with Google, and then if you throw in YouTube and obviously shopping and OTT or TV, depending on your target group, I think you're very, very well covered. Because if you look at this, if you have your perfect setup social campaign and your perfect setup social campaign, and you have an OTT/TV campaign, you cover 99% of the audiences out there. Yeah, I know we have discussed internally so many times about channel diversification, which is an important topic, but it's really hard to miss anyone when you work already with Google, Facebook, and like video vendor, if you will. Yeah. Be it TV or OTT. But I know Andreas also has an opinion on that.
For sure he has. However, I have a question that he will love even more. And I would pick this actually as the last question. Somebody asks and says, and starts with a statement, which is traditional attribution is really just a manipulation of a last click and look back window in numerous forms. In response to that statement, is effective incremental performance measured in generally the same way?
Well, I don't know whether I'm so excited about the question right now. I would have rather referred to the last one. Maybe let me try both, because I wanted to chime in on the previous question as well. So I think my answer is a little bit more boring, because I would just follow a pure data-driven approach. Means test all your different channels for incrementality, test within channels different segments and get a sense for example, divide by prospecting and retargeting, and then manage these channels just towards their incremental KPIs. I would recommend to not just take revenue into account, but rather KPI, which is a little bit more comprehensive, like new customer acquisition, customer lifetime value could be funneled in, and then activate the data and let biddable media take care of the rest. And then you arrive to some outcome, which is based upon the numbers you see and not based upon whatever, what channel you prefer, whether you like these ads or not. And this is probably the way I'd approach this in a very dry way. The second question, I mean, attribution is simply, there are credits from a sale. And now what I do, I assume that each of the clicks needs to receive some credits. So, and then I can apply time decay models or bathtub or whatsoever to assign these credits. The point here is that we don't know whether we need to assign all the credits to the different touch points. If they were all retargeting and it turns out the incremental impact is just 5%, then this is just not the right thing to do. And Madan said it initially, if you generate $1 billion in annual sales and your attribution tells you that there are 2.5 billion, you know, this is definitely not the right approach and something is wrong. So compared to this, with incrementality testing, you set up an isolated test and you just see how Madan showed the baseline and what's actually being added on top. And that's a fundamentally different approach than just taking the plain assumption these credits need to be assigned to the touch points, and I find a way to distribute something which might be fundamentally wrong just to different touch points in the journey. So these are two concepts which kind of are similar use case, but a totally different approach.
So we are now at the end of today's session. Unfortunately, we couldn't tackle all the questions that we received from the audience, but we'll definitely get back to you. And you can obviously also approach all of our speakers via LinkedIn. We've shared the contacts with you in the chat. So I thank you all for attending. I thank my speakers for participating in this discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And I wish you all a good afternoon or evening, depending where you are based and on which side of the Atlantic Ocean you're sitting. So have a good one. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.